Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me. My name is Pastor Ken Ortize, and what this is our daily devotional where I spend about 10 minutes talking about particular passages of Scripture, not just randomly, but we purposely try to go through the entirety of a book, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And some time back, we started in the book of Proverbs, which I think is one of the most important and most practical books, especially in terms of knowing how to navigate various situations that every one of us has to confront in our day-to-day lives. We left off in chapter 5 last week. We're picking it up in verse 7, where we find that Solomon is writing to his son about what I call stranger dangers. Well, let me read the passage, verse 7 on through verse 10, where Solomon says the following. He says, "Now then, my son, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep to a path far from her." I'll explain who her is in a moment. "Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your best strength to others and your years to one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enriches another man's house." So, beginning with, who is the her that he's warning his son about? Well, 5 times in the book of Proverbs, it talks about the strange woman. And that's why I call it stranger danger. It's a verb in Hebrew, zur, which literally means a foreigner or something that you're unfamiliar with, somebody who is not of us. In other words, it's a lot like when we read in the book of Numbers where the Moabite women were sent into the camp of Israelite to seduce the men into worshiping their god Baal, which involved a lot of, we call it sympathetic magic, but really it was a lot of sexual interaction of every kind that is imaginable, according to the practices of the Moabites and the Ammonites and certainly the Canaanites and many others who were worshipers of Baal in various forms and adorations. But it's translated in various translations as being a strange woman or an immoral woman or a forbidden relationship or an adulterous relationship, a loose relationship, or a woman who is a seductress. Now, lest you think I'm picking on women, we can also understand this in the greater metaphorical sense, because oftentimes not only was the idea of an immoral woman or an adulteress used as an example of literally an adulteress or an adulterous man as well, but also it referred to spiritual adultery. In other words, God looked at Israel as being his bride, his wife, and when Israel went and became involved with other gods, worshiping the gods of the nations around them, he referred to it as an adulterous action. Adulterer, or to adulterate something, means that you mix things together that don't belong together. So it's an adulterous relationship. You're mixing things. In other words, a man and a woman who aren't joined together in a sacred bond of marriage, and a heterosexual relationship, when two people join together in physical intimacy and it's not ordained or allowed by God, it becomes adulterated, and therefore we call it an adulterous relationship. It's kind of the idea of oil and water don't mix, and so it is that we should have the same aversion that oil and water seem to naturally have, but unfortunately, oftentimes that's not the case. One of the things I think is interesting is that as Solomon talks about the dangers of this woman, he said back in chapter 2 and verse 6 that she flatters. And the word that's used here, flatter, or in the original, means to be smooth and slippery as oil and deceitful. In other words, she has hidden purposes. Her idea is not to just simply be attracted, but rather to be the attractant. Her idea is that she's going to take somebody who is not wise and discerning captive. And that's why in chapter 5, in verse 3 that we looked at last week, he said that her words kind of drip like honey, and they're smoother than oil. So the initial experience is very attractive, very winsome, but later on in verse 20 of this same chapter, he says, but what she does is she enraptures. And what does enrapture mean? Well, it means to entrap somebody through pleasure. So in other words, she's using sensual pleasure as a way to draw you into territory in your life, whether it be mentally, physically, emotionally, psychologically, to draw you into territory of looking at, thinking about, meditating, focusing on, desiring and pursuing something that God says that's out of bounds. And that really is I think an important thing to remember. I remember once I was playing a video game with my wife called Words with Friends, and we'd sit in the back deck and like we were playing dominoes or something, and we'd play back and forth against each other in this word game. And eventually we had another friend from another part of the country who wanted to play as well. So I started engaging her in this game, and I began to realize very quickly that she wasn't just coming up with words in her heads, that there's another app called Words Cheat with Friends. In other words, a way that you can beat your friends without letting them know by getting helps to find the words that you're looking for. And as soon as I realized that she was cheating, I just said, I'm not interested in having this game anymore. It's the idea that something about being within the rules gives something some integrity. It gives it something that makes it worth the effort. But a relationship that's based upon any kind of cheating is not a relationship that is worthwhile, nor does it last. And oftentimes it has very unfortunate consequences. And so as a result, we find that Solomon is giving his son some very, very simple advice. And the very first thing is you don't put yourself in a position where you can be entrapped. You know, that's the whole point. If I know there's a trap out in front of me, if I know there's a danger in front of me, then the wise thing is not to go up and check it out and see if I can outsmart the deception. The wise thing is just simply to stay away from it completely. And that's why he gives this very simple guidance to his son. He said, don't turn aside. In other words, you're on a path, stay on the path. Don't get off the path that you're on. I mean, that's kind of simple instruction for all of us, but it's something that we all struggle with because as the old saying goes that curiosity kills the cat, you know, I don't care how many lives a cat has, that really it only has one, and they'll get killed if they get caught up in their curiosity, trying to look at something that just draws their attraction. And that's where Solomon is saying to his son very clearly, the very first thing you need to do is stay on the path, which is the second thing. Don't turn aside, keep on the path. And then thirdly, he says, do not go near. I mean, this is as clear an instruction or injunction as you can possibly give somebody. But it's interesting. It's kind of like when God gave the command to Adam and Eve, and he said, you know, don't eat the fruit of this tree because the day you eat it, you will die. Why was it that Eve gave in to temptation as soon as the serpent said, why don't you eat that fruit? Well, she gave the right answer. She said, God said no, and if we do, we'll die. And Satan came back and said, no, you won't. Essentially, if I can paraphrase, God's holding back on you because he doesn't want you to know what he knows. He doesn't want you to experience what he experiences. He doesn't want you to be on the same level he's on. And the answer to that is absolutely true. There are some things in my life that I do not want to experience. And if curiosity or some other desire drives me to experience him, I will have the deepest of all regrets that I gave in to that impulse. And so it's one of those kind of things. Do I listen to the advice or the warnings of other people? Well, if I trust them and I have counted them reliable, then when they say don't turn aside, when they say keep to the path, when they don't say don't go near this, then I listen to that and I pay attention because I don't have to have complete understanding why it's a bad idea. I just know that this is a trustworthy voice in my life, and they wouldn't warn me this if it wasn't true that there was a danger involved. Now, I can later on ask, give me more information. And that's what Solomon continues to do as he continues to explain to his son why he shouldn't turn aside, why he shouldn't go near, why he should stay on the path he's on. And part of that is that the path you're on is the path of life. And you don't have to experience the path of death and doom in order to know that the path of life is good. But you have to understand that there is death and doom in places where we shouldn't be. In other words, you can't just sin a little and not be affected, because sin is like a stain on a white shirt. As soon as you get that spaghetti sauce on it, Every eye is drawn to that stain on your shirt. And that's what sin does. You may say, I'm just going to dabble a little. But if you do, you're going to find that you'll get stained and you'll realize very quickly why you shouldn't have been eating spaghetti in the first place when you're wearing a white shirt. That's one of the rules of life, by the way. Never eat spaghetti with red sauce when you're wearing a white shirt. But tomorrow we'll delve a little deeper into the reasons or the consequences of going near her, the forbidden fruit. God bless. Look forward to joining you again.